and it's interesting to go to look back on how Blue Jays fans reacted in the moment. Obviously, Blue Jays fans are not super happy about it right now. At least that seems to be the general consensus, given the season that Moreno had and the fact that Varsho struggled quite a bit in his first season with the Blue Jays. We're going to get into that in a second. But yeah, there was this initial, if you were a Blue Jays fan, you're like, wow, we just traded a prospect of Gabriel Moreno's caliber for a guy who hit, 235. Like, these are not numbers that casual fans look at and are excited about. But again, so much value,
defensively.
So much value defensively that I think a lot of people overlooked. And that's why this was a really big risk for the Diamondbacks at the time. Varsho was, an emerging part of this young core, had 4 years of team control remaining at the time of the trade. And yeah, I mean, now looking back, I guess this would be a good time to look at some stats for 2023 and where each of these guys lined up. If we start with Daulton Varsho and the season that he had with the Toronto Blue Jays, not great. I just mentioned this. A 220 average, 285 on base, 389 slugging percentage. He did hit 20 home runs. There was still a showing of power there. He had 27 defensive runs saved, which I believe led all major league fielders in general, just everyone.
The crazy thing is when you watch him play defensively, he doesn't, like, it's not flashy.
That's fair. Yeah.
Like, if you watch him, he it's not like he's going out there. He's not Kevin Kiermaier and robbing home runs and diving for baseballs and making crazy, stupid plays. Like, it's just, he does your mundane stuff incredibly well.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, he does all of those things well, and you might not really notice the amount of value that he's bringing you. But again, even in a season like this, where the offensive numbers were relatively poor, I think it was an 85 OPS plus for Varsho in his first full season with the Blue Jays, he's still worth 3.9 wins above replacement, according to Baseball Reference, which is an utterly ridiculous number for a guy who is like a well below average hitter. If we flip over to Gabriel Moreno and the season he had with the Diamondbacks, here are his numbers: a 284 average, 337 on base, 408 slugging percentage, 7 home runs, 50 RBI, 20 defensive runs saved. Varsho and Moreno were both near the very top of the league. Varsho was at the very top, Moreno not far behind him in terms of defensive runs saved. Both tremendously valuable defensive players. According to Baseball Reference, Gabriel Moreno worth 4.3 WAR, so just a little bit higher than Varsho in 2023. And yeah, I mean, you look at Moreno's numbers, you look at Varsho's numbers in year one, it's pretty clear the Diamondbacks in year one got the better side of this trade. When I asked Mike Hazen about this a couple of months ago, he wasn't going to come out and say that this was a big win for the D-backs. He said he thought it was a win for both sides. But he also said that without it, the Diamondbacks don't go as far as they went. They not only, maybe don't make it to the World Series, but they probably don't make the playoffs in the first place. The Diamondbacks lost Carson Kelly, of course, early in the season. And then Gabriel Moreno, steps in and is basically your everyday catcher from day one. And that was enormous for the Diamondbacks to have someone who is ready and able to step into that spot. Without Gabriel Moreno, it would have been theoretically Jose Herrera probably stepping into the everyday role. The D-backs probably would have brought in another catcher in the offseason if Moreno had not come over in that trade. But the D-backs obviously would have been in a much worse position there.
Yeah, it's one of those, when you think back on this last season, the streak that Lourdes went on at the beginning of the season was pretty much the key factor in how this team put together probably one of the most successful starts to a season when they were 41-25.
Yeah.
Are they 41-25 if Lourdes doesn't basically go otherworldly hot in May?
Yeah, he was ridiculous in May.
He was possibly the best player in baseball in that month. I mean, his numbers were off the chart.
Yeah.
He was beating the crap out of the ball, and obviously the slump that followed was probably matched, it was probably
equal
one of the biggest reasons that they only won 5 games in one of those months. So it's one of those, it's hard to look back on this trade and say that at any point I missed Daulton Varsho.
Yeah. And I mean, it was, maybe people did miss Daulton Varsho in some ways, but the reality was the D-backs had so much depth in terms of left-handed hitting outfielders already. There was such a traffic jam. They were trading from a position of depth. The Blue Jays obviously as well were trading from a position of depth. I think the deal at the time, I think it made a lot of sense for both sides. What I wrote the night that the trade was made, this was sort of my analysis of the move that I wrote over at gophnx.com. Anyone who thinks the D-backs fleeced the Blue Jays doesn't recognize just how valuable Varsho is, and anyone who thinks the Blue Jays fleeced the Diamondbacks don't understand or doesn't recognize how rare it is for a prospect of Moreno's caliber to even be moved in the first place. Moreno was a guy who I think in the mid-season prospect rankings from Baseball America, he was a top 5 prospect. He was he was just like a couple spots behind Corbin Carroll on that list. That's how well thought of Gabriel Moreno was. And you just don't see guys move like that. You don't see guys in that position move very often. It was the kind of trade that we just don't really see. Like, we don't really see teams trade like, all right, I'm going to give you my best prospect in exchange for a very valuable major league player from another team.
And it's one of those, like, Danielle said it in the chat, you can't quantify the value of a young franchise catcher because that position already is just thin. It's a group of guys that you don't walk into like a JT Realmuto all that often.
Right.
Like you really just hope with that position that you don't get somebody that's, for lack of better examples here, like if Jose Herrera started every game after Carson Kelly went down with an injury, where's this team now? And Gabby started the season pretty cold, actually. Like it wasn't a great start for him. And so it was one of those, man, but at the same time, it was better than what you had anticipated. And it was better than what 50-60% of teams had. And now looking back on it, you have something that's probably better than what 90% of teams have behind the plate, because the value of a catcher isn't just whether you can hit. It's also like if you can throw people out, that's a weapon. If you can call a great game, that's a weapon. If like that, the person that sits behind the plate is so invaluable to who's on the mound, to the point where when this team signed Zach Greinke, they literally had to go out and sign Jeff Mathis just to come here and catch for him. Like, he was so particular about who he wanted to catch that the team had to go out and make a move. Like, there are pitchers that like just don't mesh well with a catcher. And across the board, it looked like pretty much everybody on this staff had better numbers with Gabby Moreno behind the plate than they did with Carson Kelly.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's also well documented that the Diamondbacks, just in games that Gabriel Moreno started, had a substantially better record than games where he didn't. I don't have the number in front of me. I think there were something like 21, 22 games over 500 in the games that Gabriel Moreno started, which would mean they were about, 15, 16 games under 500 in games that he did not start. So just an enormous difference there. And yeah, I mean, beyond the pretty solid offensive numbers we showed earlier, Moreno wins the NL Gold Glove in his first full season. He hits third in the lineup in the majority of the Diamondbacks postseason games on their way to the World Series. Not a bad season for a guy in his first run at the majors at just 23 years old. Impressive stuff all across the board for Gabriel Moreno. I do think it's important to point out now, I think that while the Diamondbacks certainly got the better end in year one, I mean, Lourdes was a huge piece for them. Moreno was a huge piece for them. Varsho had a bit of a down season overall. I still think that the Blue Jays could do totally fine in this trade in the long term. Daulton Varsho, if Daulton Varsho can have an 85 OPS plus and still be like a 4 WAR player, according to Baseball Reference.
How much weight is there on his defense?
Yeah, it kind of defies logic. But just think about like how good could Varsho be if he just got back.
He did still hit 20 homers. I mean,
he still had some power. But like, what could it look like if Varsho had like a 110, 115 OPS plus, which I think is totally a reasonable goal for him.
Well, yeah, he's probably a 30 home run guy if he's having an offensive season. He's got a lot of pop in his bat, and he runs pretty well. I mean, he does a lot of like you guys used to say, got all the tools, right? Daulton Varsho has all the tools. And so it's one of those, like, he inherently just has value in every asset of the game. But this team had players that could fill those positions, right? Like Alek Thomas, he statistically is not a better defender than Daulton Varsho, but he plays a mean center field. Like, I don't know if I want anybody else other than Alek Thomas out in center field right now. And Corbin's got a bat, and Alek has shown signs of life in his bat. The one that you're really waiting on is Jake McCarthy. But would you have gotten the same value out of Jake McCarthy?
Yeah.
You're not getting Gabriel Moreno and Lourdes Gurriel Jr. out of Jake McCarthy.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great point. That's another thing I wanted to touch on quickly is just the D-backs traded away their most established outfielder at the time. I know, we think back to this point, and like Corbin Carroll, of course, out of this group winds up being the best player, at least as of right now. But Corbin Carroll had only played a couple months, or really about a month in the majors. I don't think the D-backs were going to trade him anyway. They certainly viewed him as a long-term piece. We now see why. But yeah, I mean, if you had a choice between trading Varsho, trading Alek Thomas, trading Jake McCarthy, Varsho was certainly your most established player at the time. And what Mike Hazen said was that was sort of the price we had to pay in order to get the level of impact that we wanted in return. And yeah, like you said, if you traded McCarthy, if you traded Alek Thomas, you could get something. But, Mike Hazen said it was going to be less. It was going to be less in terms of years of control, where the D-backs are maybe getting back a player that had less control, as opposed to this situation where they get back a player that has more control, or just in general, just less impact, right? You're not getting a player of Gabriel Moreno's caliber if you were to trade one of those guys. And in retrospect, McCarthy and Thomas didn't necessarily have great seasons, but this still feels like the right choice was made here.